Amity Foster.
Present.
Katie Jones.
Here.
Dan Miller.
Here.
Vice Chair Willie Bridges.
Here.
Chair Jeff Strand.
Present.
So now members present but not listed on the agenda. Zechariah Aiden. Zechariah Aiden. Jocelyn Beard. Jocelyn Beard. James Brown.
Here.
Luke Cunningham.
Here.
Was that Luke?
Yeah, Luke Cunningham.
Okay. Sanja DeGarmo. Sanja DeGarmo. Kai Goodmisted.
Here.
All right. William Gullickson. William Gullickson. Risa Hustad. Risa Hustad. Matt Kazinka.
I'm here.
Okay. Richard LaRue. Richard LaRue. Erica Mauter.
Rich is here.
Rich is here. Erica Mauter.
Here.
Okay. Dan McConnell. Dan McConnell. Jake McCormick.
Here.
Jake McCormick. Here. Okay. George Montague.
Hi, here.
Beth Toso. Beth, are you with us?
I'm here. Sorry, I am here.
Todd Schumann.
Here.
Eric Wan.
Here.
Okay, so then there's a couple names. Let's go. I think I see on the list, but maybe didn't respond. But Zechariah Aiden.
Present. Sorry, I had audio issues.
Oh, all right. Jocelyn Beard. Jocelyn. Sanja Garma.
It's Sonia.
Oh, sorry, Sonia. And then William Gullickson. And then Risa. All right, with that, I think we have quorum. Back to you, Jeff.
How many were there?
Let's see.
21. It was hard to keep tabs.
I have 22.
22. Okay, thank you. Thank you. With that, we'll proceed to our agenda, a copy of which was posted for public access in the city's legislative management system, which is available at lims.minneapolismn.gov. So on today's agenda, we have the onboarding and orientation for 2021 session for new and returning CLIC members. This, of course, is the Capital Long Range Improvements Committee. And today is March 31st, 2021. We're going to be reviewing. I want to welcome everyone, and we had to go through this formality due to the COVID-19 virtual meeting rules. But I'm Jeff Strand. I'm chair of the CLIC from 2019-2020, have been on the committee some time. appointed by 3 different council members. I wanted to ask members, maybe instead of the entire group, if we just say people who would like to say what do you aspire to do to feel successful in your volunteer CLIC service? So anyone new or returning, any comments about what you would feel accomplishing and how you would feel successful in your volunteer CLIC service?
If you all don't mind, there is a raise the hand option that you can use, or you can comment in the chat that you'd like to speak, and the chair will recognize you. We're going to try not to have too many comments listed in the chat, just so that we can share with the group so everyone can see, because not everyone's monitoring the chat. So feel free to either raise your hand or to comment that you'd like to be called on.
Okay, I'm not seeing any, but if, let's come back to that and maybe after we get going. So
Jeff, it looks
today
like Katie
Okay,
Jones has her hand up.
Katie Jones, great.
Yeah, so I think at a minimum, my goal every year is to make sure I get my ratings in. And then secondly, the goal is to make sure that we're listening during the community, so the public hearings and then the community informational sessions to what we're hearing, and including those in our comments, and making sure we're taking the time to provide thoughtful comments in the report. And also continuing to nudge Public Works and other department staff to complete the feedback loop, and hopefully do that at the 2 all-day workshops.
Thanks, Katie. Eric.
Yeah, so my hope this year is to see follow through with the with our work from previous years, especially in the way of in the area of follow the comments that we've put out there. One thing that I'm looking forward to is Public Works providing us with an inventory of Public Works projects, infrastructure projects that are listed for the next few years. Particularly because there's a large sum of money hopefully coming from the federal government that's going to help us get a lot of this infrastructure backlog taken care of. So that's my goal for this year.
Steve Brandt and then John Bernstein.
In addition to the very good comments that Katie made, which I share, my goal is to come out of this beyond the individual projects in making the city council and mayor more aware, and hopefully prompt them to come up with a strategy for addressing the 2023-2026 infrastructure gap that was noted in Mike Ablin's swan song as the debt management person for the city, as looming out there in those 3 years. And it's something that we have noted as a group in our comments as well, talking about how the parks and streets commitment are crowding out other worthwhile projects.
John?
Yeah, so I would just say, without getting into real specifics for any given year, from year to year, been on this committee for a long time, my goal would be to, as fairly and unbiased as possible, assess all of the projects that are presented to us and try to view them through the lens of, from a citywide lens, and not be, in my case, the advocate for Ward 7, but rather an advocate for the entire city, and try to view things that way. And then secondarily, maybe not secondarily, and additionally, as a past task force chair, it's my goal to make sure that everyone always gets heard, and that no one ever feels like something's been railroaded or they didn't get a chance to say their piece about whatever it is we're dealing with.
Thanks, John. Anyone else?
Yes, Jeff, I do. This
Willie?
is Willie Bridges, and
Okay.
I concur with what Eric had said earlier. and to remember that we represent, as John has said, the people of Minneapolis, and that we listen to each department and what Steve has said too. So it's like, it's really important that we listen to what these departments are asking us to do, to vote on, and that we keep in mind some of the underserved areas in the city of Minneapolis. And we do represent the people of Minneapolis, and thank you.
All right, thanks, Willie. Any other members? If not, we'll move on because we have a lot to cover in a short time, and we're starting a little bit late because of our COVID rules. Eric, I think you have your hand raised. Or still up? You're muted.
I'm sorry. Yeah, a quick question. I just wanted to make sure if we write anything into the chat, that is not a part of the public record. Is that correct? Which is why we aren't supposed to put anything in chat.
That is correct,
Sure.
Eric. Partly it won't be part of the public record. The chat is more for just sharing the agenda, as I did at the start of the meeting. And then if you're unable to use the raise your hand icon or just want to be noted, just comment your name, but we don't want to be having a separate dialogue going on in the chat.
Okay, and then members have the LIMS agenda, but if Justin or Neil are able to share so that everybody can see the presentation document, that would be great.
Yep, the link to the agenda has been put in the chat.
Yep,
and
then
I can call up the presentation.
Call that up. Okay, so for today, we're going to walk through the purpose, scope, and history of CLIC. We're going to go over some of the CLIC member basics, review our bylaws and policies, procedures briefly. City staff can or should send those to you. They were revised in 2019. We're going to talk about the newly updated 2021 CLIC guidelines and the project rating schema that we have used. And then look at so we're on page 2. Look at our annual work product, which is the CLIC report. We have a obligatory joint public hearing with the Planning Commission. Then we'll transition to have the Finance and Property Services staff discuss their role in staffing and supporting the CLIC and the capital budgeting process. Go over the major component areas of the 6-year capital improvement program. And then we can get into talking about some of the logistics of being a member of CLIC, working through the virtual Teams meetings, email communications, in terms of the Minnesota Open Meetings Law, talk about capital budget request presentations that'll be recorded. And then it was brought to my attention, of course, I remember from last year, we had some members who had extreme difficulty working with the Teams software. And so we have to make sure that to the extent possible, we make sure that there are any reasonable accommodations. And also, I think people mainly with Apple, Mac products were having difficulties. Be aware of those and let's try to address those. And then most importantly, we'll talk about your questions, concerns, and comments, or as I like to put it, stump the chump session. So today, just to refresh, and people may have spoken already, but the leadership of the committee, next page. You have returning leadership. I've served as chair, Willie Bridge is vice chair. Eric Wan is now the Human Development Task Force chair. John Bernstein, Transportation Task Force chair. Katie Jones, vice chair of Transportation. And then the staffing. So I know the city staff communicated additional information about reaching out to them. I believe Amelia is the what's called the CLIC executive secretary, named in the enabling resolution. Next slide. So in terms of our purpose and mission, so as you can see, it shall be the mission of CLIC to advise the mayor and city council on what is now the 6-year capital improvement program since 2020, and the applicable policies and process and annual capital improvement budgets. So that's an excerpt from our bylaws from 2019. Next slide. And the purpose, so just so we understand, We're not like the Community Planning and Economic Development Department Redevelopment Advisory Board. We're the Capital Long Range Improvements Advisory Board. And so it is not CLIC's purpose to consider or evaluate community development programs or projects that are determined to be outside of our scope. However, we may certainly comment and recognize that some capital improvements are very critical to redevelopment and economic development activity and are pertinent to those other activities. But we don't rank the community development and economic development projects for the city. So you can find all of this information. This is sort of high level. You'll have this document that the city adopts an annual 6-year capital improvement program. The first year is the year in which the funds are appropriated. So those are projects next year that are being built. And that CLIC has 33 appointed members, 2 members per ward, 7 from the mayor. And Justin, do you want to Justin or Neil, do you want to give a very quick update on how many members are fully appointed, how many are pending council action, how many are pending their oaths, if you have that readily available?
Sure, I'm happy to. So currently, if you were going into the LIMS website, you would see that 10 members are approved by council, signed off on by the mayor, and have either taken the oath or were reappointed, and the city clerk let us list those names in LIMS proactively. So 10 are through the entire process. We had a couple other RCAs go through. One RCA has been signed off by the council and I believe signed off by the mayor. So we're just waiting to get everyone to take their oath of office, which we'll discuss later. Once that process is complete and the oaths are taken, those names will be added to LIMS. And then we have another group of individuals who were submitted for RCA approval. In the next round of council action, the mayor will sign off and then oaths will be taken. So we kind of have 3 different groups. We're looking at a total of 26 members once everyone's through. People are at different stages in group 1 and 2 as far as whether everyone's been approved but getting their oaths taken, and then that last RCA will have, it looks like it's going to be 3 additional members, some of which are here in the meeting, which is great because we want everyone to start here today at orientation, even if you're kind of moving through the approval process. And we'll walk through everyone through those stages and hopefully get to a group of probably 26 by the time we're done.
Okay, great. So as you can see from this budget overview from the last budget document, that in 2020, CLIC reviewed 130 capital budget requests, which are CBRs, and the total requested capital budget was $1.43 billion. Next slide.
And Jeff, just so you know, Steve does have his hand up as well.
Oh, okay. Steve Brandt.
Steve, I believe
Hello,
you're on mute.
I just wondered if somebody could tell me if Ward 2 has a full complement moving through the pipeline or approved, and whether I have a companion in Ward 8 after going through my entire last term without one.
I can tell you that Beth is approved through council and the mayor to represent Ward 2. There is a second vacancy in Ward 2 currently. And then in 8, Steve, you're joined by James Brown as a new appointment.
Thank you.
Okay. Slide 7. So doing historical research, pretty sure that CLIC has been around since the 1950s. This city council petition was from the 1983, speaking to the 5-year capital improvement framework and process. So it's merely just to document that CLIC has been part of the city enterprise, part of the public engagement process for many, many decades. And you'll find that CLIC is a very time-intensive group, but it is also, I'm sure that all the members returning would certify that it is a body that has a great deal of respect with the elected officials and I think among the public. and is always trying to improve engagement with the public. So the next slide, again, this is simply if you want to see more of how we fit into the city enterprise, that the Chapter 35 Minneapolis Code of Ordinances speaks to the capital improvement program, to the advisory body, the who serves as the executive secretary of the committee. And this was referenced as the latest online, most current city staff. So I'm not sure why this isn't referencing 6-year, but it isn't. And so if you want more background, next slide. Should be aware, members, that CLIC, as was mentioned, we have public meetings. There is certainly public and media scrutiny. This article is from 6 years ago, but you will find that from time to time, the capital improvement program will come under greater or lesser scrutiny. And so the press is interested in the work that CLIC does, as well as the other stakeholders in the city. Next slide. So the major annual deliverable that this body produces is the CLIC report. So the 2020 report is there. And in previous years, the report was done in hard copy. So here, if you are not looking, maybe you can't see it, but except for the cover, basically the CLIC report changed content, but the appearance didn't change over the decades. The former debt director would just rotate the color of the cover, and that would be about it. However, last year we were able to actually get some pictures into the report to liven it up a bit, so it isn't all tables and charts and narrative. But this will be the major body of work that CLIC completes and delivers to the mayor. Next slide. There is an annual joint public hearing with the Planning Commission that is scheduled, and it's in our existing schedule. So typically this meeting, which is held at 6 p.m., so May 12th, 2021, 6 p.m., all members are welcome to attend. The CLIC Executive Committee members will be asked to present and participate. And oftentimes, especially in the virtual environment, I would say that attendance is not super strong. And so it ends up being a conversation between the CLIC members and the Planning Commission members. However, there have been instances over the years where we've had maybe 70, 75 people who were attending the meeting. And that was in particular because of a concern in the East Phillips community. Next slide. So now at this point, if any of the other members would like to, the executive committee members returning want to take part in this process, so the CLIC capital guidelines, and so this should be something with which you become familiar. There is a rating summary that has a total of 300 possible points for a project. So for every single capital budget request, the group is going to decide on something called level of need. And each of these categories are defined within the guidelines. So for example, something that is critical versus significant versus important or desirable. And for example, the definition of critical describes a capital proposal as indispensable and demanding attention due to an immediate need or public endangerment if not corrected. And so very few projects can meet that high classification level. Failure to fund a critical project generally would result in suspension of a municipal service to minimize risk to the public. In contrasting that with desirable on the scale, describes a capital proposal that would provide increased public benefits, enhancement of municipal services, or other upgrading of public infrastructure. Failure to fund a desirable project would not immediately impair current municipal services. We then have a change for this year in terms of projects that have been in the capital improvement program. So we're looking at how many of these projects have been requested in previous year budget requests. And based on from 6 years to 1 year, the points are allocated accordingly. We then have contribution to city goals, which are outlined in the guidelines, and whether a project in a capital budget request has strong, moderate, or little or no contribution. We then look at operating cost savings as a percentage of the investment and use that to allocate points in that part of the CLIC rating schema. We then have qualitative criteria that are separately defined, and so these are individual rating points. And so we have those categories that are shown on that rating sheet. I'm sure we'll go more into this in the in later sessions. So next slide.
Jeff, if you'd like, I'm happy to share that in the chat as well if anyone wants to review that after orientation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the link to the updated guidelines. When CLIC completes its work, then the next step is to deliver the CLIC report to the mayor. And so here's an example of the presentation document from 2019, the meeting with Mayor Fry. And you can see the agenda for that meeting where we talked about overview of our 2019 CLIC process, the CLIC report. Former Debt Director Mike Ablin gave a financial overview. CLIC members discussed the comments and observations. We had comments from the Human Development and Transportation Task Force leaders. And then we tried to answer the questions and had a conversation with the mayor. Next slide. So to talk about basics again, all the members who are here today were all appointed to 2-year terms. 7 are appointed from the mayor. 26 total can be appointed by the city council members from the 13 wards. CLIC will elect an executive committee, so the CLIC chair, vice chair, and then the task forces will elect a vice chair and a chair for transportation and human development. So the, excuse me, the CLIC bylaws call for it to maintain a policies and procedures manual. The terms of office, as stated, are 2-year. Members serve in their positions until successors have been appointed. There is an attendance item in the bylaws that if in the event a member misses 3 meetings in a CLIC cycle, these absences will be reported to the appointing authority, that's by the staff. And then annual attendance is reported to the appointing authority. Members of the committee are subject to the city's ethics ordinance, and so you all have been sent the link to the ethics training and may have completed it. In terms of duties, the CLIC chair presides at all meetings as a spokesperson for the committee at public meetings or functions. The vice chair assumes responsibilities of the chair in their absence. The annual meeting schedule is developed among the executive secretary of CLIC and the executive committee. So we have that updated schedule that was distributed earlier. So the bylaws were approved April 27th, 2019. The policies and procedures that were adopted the same time. It talks about vision and mission, subordination of the P&P to the bylaws, talks about our structure and function, and that we have you know, the role of the executive committee is representing CLIC before the mayor, city council, and other external parties. And then we have the 2 standing committees at this point. Did we, I had asked at this point if the task force members, next slide. So Justin will send you the links to the policies and procedures and bylaws. Next slide. So before we move on to the schedule, let's see if, I know Eric Wan, you had comments about the human development, and then John, transportation, John and Katie.
John has his hand up.
That's fine. Go ahead, Eric. I'll go after you.
Okay, Justin, if you'll pull up some slides, please.
Yep, stand by.
Okay, I thought I'd give you a brief overview for those of you who are new to CLIC, and sort of a quick refresher for those of us who've been in CLIC for a while. The next slide, please. These are the general categories of investments that the Human Development Task Force looks at. And John will go over the areas that the Transportation Task Force looks at. I must say that one of the reasons I enjoy the task force is because we get to do a deeper dive of many of the projects. While in John's case, he's got, what is it, 51 projects paving alone. We get a greater variety of projects to look into. So you can see art and public places, MPD and fire department buildings, municipal building commission, which includes the new public service building, park board, that would be MPRB spending, and public grounds and facilities. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we prepare the annual CLIC report, there's an area where we as task forces and as the entire committee can provide comments, detailed comments, along with our budget advice. This is one of the comments from this past year that was timely, and I'd like to follow up with this year to find out if the Public Works Department is able to provide us with this product. So I'll read it very quickly. CLIC recommends that the Department of Public Works develops, in collaboration with city residents, a 30-year infrastructure replacement plan that recognizes changing requirements, investment strategies, environmental and climate goals, and emerging technologies. What's important about this is in the process of doing our CLIC work, we get to communicate and chat with many of the leaders in the cities in the city, and in speaking to many of the leadership, the department heads, I discovered that there was no inventory of infrastructure for the city, much of which is 50 to 100 years old. So there was a likelihood that a balloon is going to be hitting us soon, where a lot of the infrastructure will need to be replaced. So this inventory would facilitate us looking at the longer term investments that are going to be required for infrastructure. And one other reason this is important right now is with what the Biden administration is talking about, with a $2 to $3 trillion investment in infrastructure across the country for the next over the next 8 years. It's going to be important for us to have our list of projects that are shovel ready, so that we can be first in line for some of that, what will turn out to be the largesse of spending in infrastructure in Minneapolis history. Next slide, please. So a second comment that I'd like to highlight was something that in our Human Development Task Force, we had some discussion, significant discussion. It had to do with it was triggered by the need to rebuild the 3rd precinct, which had burned down before our conversations. So what we found was that there was not sufficient policy guidance from the city council or the mayor to advise us on what to do with this investment in a new 1st police precinct and in proposals to move the 4th police precinct. So what the Human Development Task Force did was we provided some advice to the city, and it basically said we would like to ask for I'll say a pause in building of police infrastructure until such time as clear guidance was provided to us on what the future of policing would look like. So you'll find this language in the 2021 CLIC report, providing, I guess, explaining why in the end our ratings for police buildings were fairly low. And it wasn't because they were low as priorities, but rather we didn't have sufficient policy information to make recommendations. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's an example of where the CLIC was able to say circumstances have changed. There are new policies in place, particularly around climate change. Katie, I believe this was at your suggestion. I'm glad we got this in. What the city budget did was it consolidated gasoline and diesel infrastructure with electric vehicle chargers. And what we asked the city to do for the coming budget cycle is to separate the two, since we're supposed to be weaning ourselves away from fossil fuels and moving towards electric chargers. And by separating the two sources, we'll be able to implement more of the policies, especially those around climate change. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide. These are just a few things that I believe we're going to be looking at in the upcoming year. Number one is if indeed the federal infrastructure investment of $2 to $3 trillion comes into play, where we as a city are going to have to look at the types of infrastructure investments that we'd like to make. And it's clear that they're looking for shovel-ready projects. So hopefully we'll have a set of projects ready to offer to the federal government for funding. Let me see, we can skip number 2. We spoke about that already. That inventory of infrastructure needs that our city will be facing over the next few years. And finally, a recurring theme that we bring up with the city is a need to include more public participation in deciding what the priorities are for investments in Minneapolis. The way this current process is structured, the public doesn't get to really participate until the proposals are already submitted to the city. So we're trying to figure out a way to get the public to provide input to the department heads before they submit their budget requests to the CLIC. And that's about all I have. We can come back for questions a little later, but I believe I'm handing it over to John now.
Fine.
Yeah. So I'm John Bernstein. I'm the current Transportation Task Force Chair, but we will be holding elections for the coming year, I believe next week. Let me just back up and start by saying that the committee is basically divided into two between these two task forces. And the way that works is that there's somebody from each ward that represents each of the two task forces. And the mayoral appointments, there's 7 of those, so they're divided 3 and 4 ideally between these. So these are, and typically this isn't something you really choose depending on the year. It's just, if the opening is an opening in Ward 2 on the Transportation Task Force, that's where you end up. The good news is about that is that regardless of which task force you're on, it does not preclude your ability to be a full participant in the projects that are covered by the other task force. Some of the projects or types of projects that Eric had listed on there weren't quite right. Transportation does most of the water projects, and you can make arguments either way about where projects should end up. And the reality is that broadly, it's between transportation and human development, but it's also about dividing the workload reasonably evenly. So the thing I really want to underscore is if your passion is street paving and you are on human development, don't fret. The key things that these task forces do, our first task force specific meetings will be at the end of the 2 full-day presentation days. And our task on those 2 days will be to vote as a task force on each project that comes under the 2 task forces. So let's just take transportation. On the transportation projects, we'll vote which category in the scoring system is the project priority and the city contribution to goals. So if you think back to the sheet that was up during Jeff's presentation, the project priority is the critical, significant, important, desirable. So as a committee, we'll decide where each of those projects that fall under transportation should be, along with city goals, which is again, strong, moderate, and little to no contribution. The point of that, if you go back about 5 years ago, once the task forces did that, all members of the committee were required to keep their vote range within that category. So it went by quickly, but of the points that you can assign under project priority, there's about a 10-point range in each of those categories. So once it was voted on for a category, thank you for putting that up. So if you look up at the top of this form under project priority, you see critical. Back then, if a project was deemed critical, then you had the leeway to give it anywhere from 51 to 65 points, and you couldn't deviate outside of that. About 5 years ago or so, we changed that to make it strong guidance. So the idea is that you are, unless you have very strong feelings otherwise, you should stay within wherever the task force puts that. But you do have the ability as an individual rater to go outside of that range. So again, at the end of the 2 full-day presentations, the Transportation Task Force will go through all of the transportation projects and rate them on project priority, and then the third thing down here, contribution to city goals. The other important thing that the 2 task forces do is draft initial comments on the projects that fall within their purview. So again, if you are passionate about HD type projects and you're on transportation, that does not stop you from authoring comments about those projects. You just aren't at those meetings where that's occurring. So you would author a comment and email it to Eric or somebody else on the committee, and that will get voted on by that committee, that task force. The other important point on this is that nothing happens solely at the task force level. Nothing comes out of this committee from a task force. Everything comes out of the full committee. So all of the task force work is then forwarded on to the full committee. As an example, the comments that we do. After the Transportation Task Force approves a set of draft comments and HD does the same, we'll come together as a full committee. Nothing gets into the report unless the full committee approves it. So you get, even if you're not on the committee that you really want to be on, you get a chance to speak about these and even introduce new ones. The point of this is to get this stuff done ahead of time, but there's nothing in our rules or our procedures that precludes somebody from introducing a comment that wasn't seen by either task force once the full committee is together. So the point of these committees is divide and conquer and get work done, but it in no way excludes you from being a participant in those projects. One, because you can participate, as I said, through email, and also once we come together as a committee. And then the final thing I would say about that is there's 120 projects roughly each year. And the good news and the bad news is you get to vote on all of them. You rate all of them regardless of which committee you're on. So after the very relatively short meetings we'll have as a task force at the end of the 2 full-day presentations, you'll see in the schedule there's about 3 meetings in May that are scheduled, and those meetings are the meetings where we'll be dealing with the comments. And that's comments that are authored by people within the task forces and comments that come from somebody who's not on the task force that we consider as a task force. And I think that's really all I have to say about how that works.
Thanks, John. And we have a question from Steve. I put the link to the past CLIC reports in the chat. I apologize to the public, but those are on the city website. If you just Google or go to the city website and just do CLIC reports, it'll bring you right to that page. So Steve.
Jeff and Eric, do you anticipate which meeting we will elect a vice chair to serve with Eric?
We have our schedule that Justin could actually advance. There you slide 16. So we are looking at April 7th to keep our process going. So all of the positions will be open for nomination and election. I wanted to check with Katie. If Katie, as vice chair, did you have anything to add for the transportation?
I don't.
Okay. So members, just looking at the slide 16. So we have today's orientation. You have the first meeting on April 7th, Wednesday, noon to 1:30. The city staff then has the capital budget requests due from the departments and the independent boards and Municipal Building Commission coming into their system. We'll have meeting number 2 on April 14th with the mayor, Mayor Fry, and the council president and the Ways and Means chair to have them discuss their priorities with the committee. We then have our, normally in a non-virtual setting, members, we have 8 hours that we spend together at a public facility in person, including a free lunch. And so no free lunch this year, but you will have, Justin, you want to talk about the logistics for that? We are having recordings once again. And then we'll have a Q&A session basically. So the members would want to review the presentations and then bring their questions to the so-called full day sessions. Justin?
Yep. And Jeff, I'm just going to pull up another PDF because I know we did update the schedule a little bit from when the slide was created.
Okay.
So let me share that as well because we do have a couple more dates scheduled. Here we go. All right. So as you can see, there's a couple other dates that are scheduled, including some of the public input sessions. So this was the schedule that was sent out to all members. As far as the presentations, we'll cover this in just a little bit as well. In an effort to shorten the length of the presentation days, we'll still keep it at 2 days, but instead of having those be full days, we are encouraging the departments to pre-record their presentations. And then Neil and I were actually in a meeting today with City IT to facilitate that so that we can have all these presentations available for your viewing prior to those presentation sessions. That'll just speed up the process that you'll be able to do a lot of the pre-work ahead of the time. And then those departments will be available for Q&A on those all-day presentation dates, but the presentations will be viewed prior to that. So that'll just shorten our time frame, but that schedule is being developed and Neil's working on that currently.
Okay. John.
I was just going to make a comment about for the new members about dealing with the 2 days of full day presentations. You're going to see 120 projects. There's no way to dive into this without feeling overwhelmed, especially relative to some of us that have been around. If for no other reason than because this is a 5- and 6-year process, something like 80% of these projects returning members have seen before and may have seen before 4 or 5 times in past years. So we're quite familiar with a lot of them, and we know where the hot points are, and we know how to get to them quickly and ask the questions that are applicable. So it might make your head spin a little bit. It's totally normal. That you should feel that way, and I don't think there's any way around it, because you're seeing 120 projects for the very first time. So I would encourage you, to the extent that you can, to look through the They're called, we call them CBRs. It's capital budget requests. There'll be one for each project. You'll quickly learn where in each CBR where the key information is as you start to look through them. And I would encourage you to just skim that before the meeting so you have a little bit of familiarity, but just be prepared to feel a little bit overwhelmed. I don't think there's any way around that, and it's completely normal.
Thanks, John. And then we have Steve and then Willie.
I noticed that the schedule has the capital budget request due on April 8th. Is that when the finance department receives them or when we will receive them?
Neil or Justin?
So I believe that we pushed back that date. So maybe we need to update this calendar because I believe that capital budget requests are due on the 14th.
Okay. Steve, that's typically the date that it's due to the city staff, but Willie?
I think for the new members, as John has said and Eric has both have said, feel free to reach out and ask questions of each one of them. And also don't be afraid to ask questions of things that you really don't understand and voice your opinion. That's what this is about. That's what CLIC is about, that we have different opinions, and feel free to speak up and to ask those questions. But John and Eric, and as John says, some of us been around, you will have our phone numbers, but you should feel free to call.
Thanks, Willie. And Dan Miller.
Yes, hello. I just wanted to say that I thought last year's presentations that were taped were very helpful in that you could sort of take a bite-sized chunk out of this thing and actually go back and review it if you felt you needed to. And so I'm happy to see that happening again. And I found that to be very, very helpful what happened last year. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And we talked earlier, and while you're talking, do you want to just touch base on some of the technical side for someone who's very adept at computers and has, up-to-date hardware, but with the Teams meetings, some of your experience?
I think a lot of the difficulties I've had over the last year with Teams is sometimes stuff that is available internally. I think within the city department, I'm a guest sometimes. Like Justin tried to post something that in the chat that I couldn't get at. It came up as being forbidden as a thing, and I don't know how to get around it other than that. Sometimes I'll see sort of a menu board at the bottom of the screen. Sometimes it'll be on the top of the screen. Sometimes people talk about being in Chrome. I don't know. It's just it can be, I guess, somewhat frustrating. And perhaps the best way to go about it is just to point it out when it's happening.
Excellent advice. So members, don't get frustrated. Don't give up. Persevere. Speak up, mention that you're having difficulties, ask questions. If you're having access difficulties or need documents, please make your voices heard, and we'll try to work through any problems that come up through this virtual environment. It's difficult for everybody. So we should keep this presentation moving. We're at 3 o'clock, and why don't we resume? So noting the changes, so the next thing, member basics. So here's a slide from a few years ago with a tour of the Hiawatha campus. So open meetings law compliance, we could have a separate section from the city clerk if people desire. I know from past service on the NRP and Neighborhood and Community Engagement and CLIC that email chains are not permitted or severely frowned upon. I think we will suggest that our city staff who work with the city clerk more closely can maybe give us a short update, or even whomever is in the leadership, maybe have the city clerk give a 15-minute update so that we don't violate the open meetings law. Compliance with ethics in government. So show of hands, how many people have already done their ethics training for the next 4 years? Quite a few? Great. And then your oath of office. So we know that Justin updated us on that. So virtual meetings, presentation dates will be shared with you all, have been shared. So next slide. So when you do your ethics training, you get that handy dandy certificate that you create, and it automatically goes back to the city clerk's office. So in your training, you had some other pages, and so you have a ethics officer hotline. Ethics officer is an attorney named Susan Trammell, Trammell, and ethics officer at minneapolismn.gov or 612-673-3230 if you have any questions or concerns. And then you will have the city clerk will get the oath back to you once it's been fully executed. If anyone's having any issues about getting access to the clerk's office because of the trial or other reasons or a notary public, please let the city staff know, or you can reach out to me and I will try to facilitate something for you. Next slide. Just wanted to put in this part about community engagement. So the Neighborhood and Community Engagement Commission existed and is now no longer existing, but Neighborhood and Community Relations. So just illustrating that CLIC is the public engagement process for capital improvement. It has been said by past mayors to this committee. However, we want to engage with our peers and fellow residents throughout the city. Next slide. The City of Minneapolis adopted the core principles of community engagement some time ago. These are from the International Association for Public Participation. You can see these various right to be involved, contributions will be thoughtfully considered, recognize needs of all, seek out involvement, etc. Last but not least, known effective participation. The CLIC itself, we always want to know, how did you use the recommendations that we made in our report? Did you put our report on the shelf and ignore it, or were those actually taken into, thoughtfully considered and taken into account and implemented? So CLIC is always looking for feedback from our past prior year reports recommendations. And we really expect that from our city departments and independent boards, as well as the Municipal Building Commission. Next slide. These are the benefits of community engagement. It's not an all-inclusive list, but we have mutual respect among stakeholders, improved relationship with the community. Next slide. Tools for more equitable and ecological minded engagement. So the city has, and you can access, I'm sure that we can have finance and property services share. The city has a racial equity impact assessment tool. The NCR department and the NCEC had a blueprint for equitable engagement. That's what that graphic is intending to represent. And the city had adopted a city climate action plan. Next slide. So now we want to get into the finance and property services and have the staff talk about how they will support the CLIC. These two snippets indicate that what the role is, and then CLIC's recommendations serve as a starting point from which the mayor and city council's decisions are made. So I will hand it over to Finance and Property Services to walk through the next few slides and how they staff and support the CLIC process.
Sure. So I can start, and I'll start just by kind of talking about our roles and the faces that you'll see from finance. So my name is Amelia Kruver. There we go. Thank you. I'm the interim budget director. I'm the permanent budget director now. So, so you'll be seeing me all year. I am working with Justin and Neil, who you've seen at the beginning of this. So Justin is helping us with CLIC this year. He's been detailed into budget to help with the large amount of work we have ahead of us this year. And he's been just a fantastic support and has been really helping get the logistics down for getting all of our new members appointed, understanding what needs to happen before you can be a full voting member, and getting our calendar locked down. So for those kinds of things, I think you have been hearing from Justin, and you should continue to use him as a resource. For our other sort of principal analyst position, those of you that were here last year remember Robert Harrison. He is still our lead CLIC person, and he should be back by the next meeting we have. Neil is filling in for Robert right now. One thing that we noticed after last year's work is that there were really only 2 members of our team that were involved in the CLIC process, Micah Intermill and Robert. And we want to build a better bench on our team of people that are familiar with CLIC, understand your work. So you'll see some more faces from the budget office this year as there are opportunities to learn more about this work. So I think that's the sort of folks to call. If you have questions about the logistics, I would start with Justin. And as we move into more questions about analysis or the city finances, you can direct those questions to Neil in the short term and Robert long term, but always me, and I can staff it to the right person if it's not me. We can go. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Did you set up a new email that I didn't have when I was doing this presentation document?
Oh, I don't think so.
The group email? Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay.
If we did, somebody else did it, and I great. Okay, so logistics. Justin, did you want to talk through this slide and then hand it back over when we get to the finances section?
Yep, absolutely. And I think I can clarify that email as well.
Oh, good.
So as far as meeting attendance expectations, Jeff kind of alluded to this, that the expectations for attendance are in the bylaws, but we appreciate members being at all meetings, and this just keeps everyone on the same page and facilitates good discussion. If you are going to be absent, please let a member of the staff, myself or Neil or Robert, know, and also let Jeff know so that we can kind of keep track of who's going to be present. At this time, we do expect all of our meetings to be virtual. If that is able to change in the future, we will update everyone, but you should have received a calendar invite for each of the meetings that are scheduled. There are a couple meetings, such as the public hearings, that haven't been quite worked out in Teams yet. A lot of those invitations did go out. It would have been sent to the email that you had on your application. So if you're going to use a different email for accessing Teams, just let us know and we can update that in our list. We also have a call-in feature. So if you have any technical issues, you get bumped off of the call or you're unable to connect, that call-in number is listed in LIMS on the agenda. It's also listed in the Teams invite and will be posted in the chat, which I appreciate Dan bringing up that there may be some issues with who can access the chat. So we are going to follow up on that, but you do have that dial-in option as well if you cannot connect live. We will have a distribution of the CLIC contact list. So we have a roster that we're putting together. As we had said earlier, people are moving through different phases of the approval process. So we're trying to get the update in LIMS and then also share an accurate number of members. The deadline for applications for CLIC was actually today. So as the application window closes, really the only other members that we could get at this point would be anyone who had sent in an application, but it's just pending council member approval because each of the individual members need to sign off on the appointment prior to the full council vote. So we're kind of going to narrow down who is actually going to be a member this year. We'll know more after today. We do have the CLIC channel or the CLIC distribution list. That's what all of our teams meeting invites come out from. So if you notice, if you respond to a calendar invite or send a response that goes to everybody, we separately have a CLIC at minneapolismn.gov email account that isn't necessarily new. It just maybe wasn't utilized fully previously. So there are just those two different emails, either the CLIC MST or the CLIC at minneapolismn.gov. So you'll see emails come from both groups. One includes everybody. One is just the email that goes to staff. You can also always email any of us directly. As far as parking, there is a reimbursement for parking at this time. That's not going to be applicable, but we'll revisit that if we do end up meeting in person. Our presentations are going to be, the CBRs are going to be recorded, as we mentioned earlier, with a shortened day of Q&A. So that'll hopefully shorten up those full day CLIC capital budget request meetings. And then some of those, that joint public hearing, public input sessions, public comments, some of those have not been sent out yet in Teams as invites, but they are all on the schedule that you should have received. If you do receive any immediate inquiries, we ask that you contact staff as well as the CLIC Executive Committee so that they can follow up accordingly. Otherwise, if you have any questions on your oath of office, ethics training, where you're at in the approval process, if you want to discuss the elections that are coming up at the next meeting, the task forces, or just the logistics of Teams, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to assist.
All right. So the next few slides, we're going to talk a little bit about the finances. This is a just a copy and paste from the 21 to 26 council adopted capital improvement plan. And I'm actually going to put a link into the chat that will take you to the full capital improvement information that was a part of the budget book in case you want to look through some of the data. So we have, as a part of our 21 council adopted budget, we've included the 21 through 26 council adopted capital improvement plan. There you can review the specific projects that were included, as well as the financial snapshot information from last year. One thing that will stand out to you is that in general, the recommendations put forward by CLIC were lower in general than what the mayor proposed and what the council adopted. And I know there was some discussion earlier about the reasons driving that, some of the questions that were brought about pause on funding for police buildings and things like that. But you can dig into those details more in that document to have a better understanding of sort of how the 21 budget process all played out. If you go to the next slide, I can talk about the resources that we're starting with this year. So every year in January or February, the council approves the sort of 6-year outlook for resources for the capital program. Mike Abelin did this for the last several years, for those of you that have done this before. And I was, me and Robert sat down with Mike several times before he left this year to make sure we're really understanding his vision and his debt service program, and so we can explain it to others as we move forward. I'll pause right here. Actually, it looks like there's some questions. Can't quite see who has their hand up, but I think
Scott.
Go ahead.
Yes, can you send out that link to the email? I can't get in the chat.
Oh.
Yes.
So that's good information that I don't know if I've ever seen before. So.
Oh, yeah.
Like, where does our recommendations, they go to the mayor and the city council and they approve a budget. Do they listen to what we say? So that this would explain it, right?
That's right. That's right. Happy to include that in an email out to you guys afterwards. We can just dump all the stuff that's wound up in the chat. So this document lays out the resources available for the net debt bond resources available for capital work. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of how to use this document. This deals with what we call net debt bonds. So these are the general fund supported bonds, or general fund supported programs, which includes bond proceeds as well as cash. There are other things that are part of the capital program, dollars from state and federal sources. This is just looking at that general fund piece of the pie. So the very top section, this uses and sources, this shows you the total amount of money made available for capital spending from the general fund. And that includes bonds as well as cash. You'll see the 21 adopted levels plus the out years that we'll be looking at this year in CLIC. The net debt bonds are really the general fund resources available for flexible city projects. The other category you'll see is the Parks and Streets plan. And so that is part of the 20-year plan that was adopted. This follows the sort of amounts in that original plan. And there is a section supported by bond sales and a section supported by cash, which is called PAYGO. So the uses, that really shows where, you know, what's earmarked for Parks and Streets and what's earmarked for general projects. The sources shows you that what is made available by bond proceeds and what is just cash from the levy that is being applied to capital uses. One thing you'll see that's different this year is a big jump in our levy. And I guess I'll go down to the bottom box first and explain it there. So the bottom section that says bond redemption levy for capital projects, this shows the impact on the levy. So this is paying for debt that we've already issued. It's paying for bills we already have to pay, as well as how much cash we're taking from the levy to use in our debt service program. And you'll see a line down there that's been highlighted that says existing library downtown office debt. So that $10 million, if you were to look at the city's levy information, that's a part of the capital, or the part of the whole budget process, that lived on its own line because it was a part of the library deal. And in 2020, that was the last year we made a payment on that debt. In 21 and beyond, that levy amount will be applied to the new public service building downtown. And so that those dollars will be rolled up into the total bond redemption levy. So it looks like we've had a $10 million increase, but this is really just kind of a planned movement of $10 million that was reserved for one purpose, the library debt, is now being moved into the total line for bond redemption that we're used to paying attention to. So I wanted to call out and explain that difference because that's a big change. But the rest of the information down here, if you look at just the total tax levy, that shows you how much of our property fund levy is going towards bond redemption each year. And there's a slow and steady sort of inflationary increase each year that is reflected in the similar sort of slow and steady increases in the uses in the top table. So this is just sort of a sketch of how we finance our capital programs, how we use our general funds, I should say, to support this work. And this goes through, this went through council in February as a way to sort of really kick off the capital planning process. Now, one thing you will notice when you compare the compare what CLIC recommended last year and what the mayor recommended, this is sort of drawing a line through those two. So this supports more spending than was recommended in last year's CLIC recommendations, but it supports, especially in 23 and beyond, slightly less spending than what the mayor or council included in their budget. So this is a year where, for those out years, just as I heard mentioned in sort of some of the opening statements from you guys, this is a year in which we'll have to make decisions about 23 and beyond, what to fund and what not to fund. And what CLIC recommended last year, like I said, there is, you guys, I believe, came in under this amount of funding. The mayor and council came in over. So this is a year where we really need to make decisions about funding, especially in those out years. And this is really your guide to what those resources are and how they were how we arrived at them. So I'll pause for questions here before moving on. Looks like there's one.
Steve.
Oh, Steve.
Steve Brandt.
Mhm.
Will this overview be made available for those of us who can't read it on the screen?
Sure. This is up in
Yeah.
LIMS. It was passed by council in February, so we can send the link to that, or we can send the PDF.
Either one.
Mhm. Great.
Okay. Thanks, Amelia. You have the next slide that just talks about some of the abbreviations and what, some of the definitions. So we aren't too jargonish in our conversations.
Sure. Go ahead.
Just a quick thing. I want to go back to Scott's question. Scott, yes, they listen to what we have to say, 85%, but they can change it.
Thanks, Willie.
Yes.
And can I just say that pointing out one thing in the document that Amelia is going to share, the capital decision document is really useful. It compares what CLIC recommended to what the mayor recommended to what the council adopted. So it's like page 546, I think, if I remember correctly. But
That's right.
and I'm just going to suggest, because we're running low on time and we definitely want to get to the Q&A.
Yep.
That we should also walk through the CLIC guidelines rating schema on April 7th or 14th so that members understand that, and especially how it was changed after the last session.
Sounds good.
Anything else for the department perspective?
Eric, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, actually, it's a recommendation that people go through the detail comparison of what CLIC recommended and what the mayor and council actually did. There was a very interesting move last year where there was just one segment of road that wasn't financed, and it was worth $13.5 million. So there's a lot to learn by looking at the side-by-side comparisons. I would spend a little time just to catch up with the types of decisions that go on after the CLIC is done.
Thanks, Eric. John?
Yeah, I just want to give a little context to that. This past, so the sheet that Amelia just shared, we get that something like that every year. Last year, and as she mentioned, that typically comes out in February. So if you recall last year, that would have been pre-COVID last year. We met fairly late last year because of the pandemic and just getting organized. A request of the city council to give us an updated version of that, which they did not do. So we were flying a little bit blind last year, making a presumption, which is exactly what it was, that they would not be able to maintain those funding levels as a result of everything that was happening in the city. They did maintain those funding levels. So the caveat that I just want to make sure newer people are aware of is that the variance between what we recommended and what they adopted was a little larger last year than it's been in recent history as a result, I think largely because of that. If you go way back in history to the early 90s, under 3 or 4 mayors ago, there was a lot of variance between what CLIC recommended and what actually went on. But for the last 20 plus years, the percentage of our recommendations that get adopted is fairly high.
Thanks for that. That's helpful context.
Next slide, please. And next slide. So a little lighthearted, we used to have this CLIC bingo for our full day presentations that, if you hear some of the things that we expect to hear, maybe year after year. And let's go to the last, to the question and answer. So thanks, members, for attending. And I know that I want to say it's really challenging to do this in a virtual environment. Dan Miller has a question, but let's try to get as many as we can here. Dan? And G.J. Montague.
Yes, I just wanted to go back to the schedule a bit. And there's 2 dates on there that talk about public input sessions. I don't recall those in previous schedules. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, Dan, that was instituted several years ago when former Chair Tony Hofstad retired, and we had public input sessions to get input from the public outside of the joint public hearing with the Planning Commission that was always held in the middle of the, supper or dinner hour in the middle of downtown. And so we tried to go out in the community and meet with residents and get their input, which actually in a number of times did actually played into one program for I think the GAP Sidewalks program. So virtual meetings again will be a little more challenging, but we have typically held those out in the community
Okay.
for like the past 6 years, I think.
Got it. Thank you.
And whoever can help see the hands up, I think GJ.
Yeah, hi, this is George. My question is, right now there's proposed federal infrastructure spending that's under consideration. If that gets approved, will that affect any of the work or analysis that's being done as part of CLIC or no?
I can take a stab at that and say that we don't know yet. We don't have a formal process. We're right now sort of working to kickstart the 2022 regular budget development process and setting up a formal process for approving the first wave in the ARPA funds, the American Rescue Plan Act funds. And so we haven't contemplated what it looks like for infrastructure specific funds yet, but it's definitely something to think about, especially as it is looking more and more likely every day.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah.
And James, I don't think James has spoken yet with questions.
Is it unmuted?
Yes.
I had a question on the first slide that Amelia showed about bonds. Are the last column, is that, maybe you can click back to that slide. Bond redemption, is that from the sale of bonds, or can you just explain that? What is that column exactly?
Absolutely. So if you look at go forward one, at the very bottom, the bond redemption levy, this just says this is the amount of cash, this is the amount of money that comes in the property tax levy that we use to pay down our current debts. So this is based on all of the times we've sold bonds in the past. What are we still paying down? That number, 57.3 million, is how much we will pay in 21 on either old debts or debts that we've sold during the year in 21 to finance capital.
And that's only in regards to capital projects. There's other bonds.
That's right. Well,
this is just what we're looking at.
Yeah, this is only in regards to capital projects. The other part of the levy goes mostly to the general fund to support city operations, as well as to the park board. There's a couple other smaller ones in there, but yeah.
Great. That was my only question. Thank you.
Steve Brandt.
On that point, I wondered if it all goes to the current year's payment or whether any is put into a required reserve. And then secondly, getting back to the public input sessions, we have repeatedly asked for more support from, I think the appropriate entity would be the City Communications Department in publicizing those sessions and getting out the word on social media. And I'm just wondering if there's going to be any improvement in that regard this year.
So I'm not sure about the first question. I would need to dig in a little bit to what the specific payments look like. If there is a reserve, I imagine this is really in the wheelhouse of our debt manager, sort of how they're treating, if they're putting cash somewhere that's maybe a little bit more interest bearing at sometimes and making payments. I am sure that all exists. We'll need to ask our debt payment folks, which I know are very close to hiring a replacement for Mike Ablin. And we're happy to reach out to communications to see what they can do this year.
and NCR department perhaps as well?
Yeah. Yep,
Okay.
that's a great idea.
Okay, fabulous. We had 25 people in our meeting. If anyone has any questions that they didn't ask or that come up after this concludes, I would say put those in an email to the city staff, and I'm sure they can share those with returning members who may have experience and answers, and we'll get back to you. Are there any last questions? We have John.
I just offer as at least for Transportation Task Force Chair, if anybody who's on that task force has questions or would like further clarification, either reach out to me directly. I'm more than happy to spend time with anybody that would like to talk about how any of this works.
Awesome.
Okay, I know others have to jump to a 3:30 meeting. And credit for the CLIC bingo goes to Erica Motter, apparently. Thank you, Erica. So I know others have 3:30 meetings, and appreciate the strong attendance today. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out to the city staff. And like John, I'm perfectly willing to talk with any member about any questions. And my number is 612-710-6147, going out to the world now. So I have to read a short statement apparently before we adjourn, if there are no final questions.
No, Jeff, I think we're good to adjourn. We'll send out
Okay.
a recap and anything that was in the chat or files. We'll follow up with that as well. Thanks,
All right.
everybody.
So without objection, we'll declare this meeting adjourned. Next meeting will be Wednesday, April 7th, 2021, noon to 1:30. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.